for hosting Professor Malik from Oxford University, Great Britain, with the topic of state policy under authoritarianism, evidence from Muslim societies. It is not true to find some evidences. I joked Professor Malik. He is in Istanbul for a conference of Al-Sharq Forum, and while he is in Istanbul, we invited him for a lecture at İLKE, TODAM, and he joined us. Thank you. And we are ready to listen.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. I gave a talk here like 4 years back, or 3, in 2019. 19, April 2019. And the moment I came to this foundation, I immediately fell in love. It has that very nice feel to it, very spiritual, grounded feel to it, and the whole area. So when Hassan learned that I'm going to be here, and he approached me, I immediately said yes. It was a great pleasure to be back. Okay, so I realized that quite a lot of you would be non-economists, so you come from a variety of disciplines. So I'm going to first introduce myself, and then introduce you to the project. So this is not one paper, it's a series of papers that I've been working on. And I will provide you a preview of some of the main findings and the overall argument that I'm developing as part of this project. And in doing so, I will be also showcasing some of the methods that I use for this project, because many of you are PhD students, so you might like to know how I collect data, how do I combine them with rigorous empirical methods, how do I pose hypotheses, how do I test them, what's the larger argument that I'm doing. But as is often the case with projects like these, they could be quite involved in terms of data, and you can lose the big picture. And you get too much into specifics and you lose the big picture. So I'm not going to leave you guessing what the project is about. Maybe I'll spend the first 2-3 minutes really describing the sort of larger argument that I'm trying to push as part of this. I'm increasingly interested in the political economy of authoritarian rule. Right? When we think about authoritarianism, and often we think of authoritarianism as non-democracies, because there are different types of autocratic regimes, right? So you have the monarchies, you have military rule, you have personalized rule, like single-party rule in Ethiopia, all range of places. So we're really talking about authoritarian regimes as being non-democracies. Centralized rule. We often think of authoritarian regimes as regimes that repress people, that impose a lot of violence, they're very powerful, you know, dictators, and of course they don't need to seek support from ordinary people because they are, you know, the dictators. But in political economy, there's been growing work around the political economy of authoritarian rule, that an autocratic ruler needs to have instruments in place, needs to organize the economy in particular ways, needs to organize the polity in particular ways. And of course, all kind of centralized power requires legitimacy. They repress people, so there's always repression, but there's legitimacy. They need legitimacy, so that's why a lot of military regimes draw on, you know, you are a descendant of a prophet, or you are Sayyid, or you are, you know, belong to a particular ideology, or you use Islam in a particular way. Right? And apart from legitimacy and repression, authoritarian regimes also use a third element, which is very important, which is co-option. You need to co-opt key segments of society in your authoritarian structure. So authoritarianism, in a lot of recent political science literature, argues that authoritarianism is what we describe as joint rule. It's not the rule of one person. They need allies. And it's in the same way as a global superpower, maybe America, for example, or British Empire way back in time. They need allies everywhere. Right? Same is the case for an autocratic ruler. It's a joint rule. They need to have key segments of society aligned with them. And so, if you're thinking from the perspective of an authoritarian objective function, the autocrat's worldview, he needs to think about society being consisting of masses, lots of ordinary people, and then elites. And a lot of autocratic regimes support the masses by giving them subsidies. In the Arab world, for example, they would give them subsidies, food subsidies, authoritarian social contract, welfare, a lot of those things, education, health. But they need to have elites on their side. Why? Because every time an autocratic ruler fears, there are two big problems. There's problem of information. You don't know how much support you have from the population. Every autocratic ruler, no matter how powerful he is very fearful. A huge fear. In fact, a lot of cruelty really emanates from fear. And that fear is partly rooted in lack of information. How much support do I have in the population? And so the biggest threat that authoritarian regimes face is from insiders. That's why you have coups from within the regime, or a whole range of other threats from within the ruling coalition. And so political economy is increasingly talking about not just authoritarian rulers, they're talking about the dominant coalition. What is the coalition of interest groups who support that authoritarian order? And when we think about political rule in these societies, you're talking about the sort of selectorate. There's a great piece of work by Bureau de Mosquito talks about the logic of authoritarian rule, where he talks about there's a selectorate, and then there's a winning coalition, which is a subset of the selectorate, which is a set of people whose support is absolutely needed for the ruler to be inside. For example, it could be military, it could be key businesses, it could be key religious families, religious classes, right? And so, how do you support them? And how do you co-opt their support? You cannot just co-opt these classes by repressing them. Yes, of course, those who don't agree, you will put them in jail, or ostracize them, or maybe kill them. But you can't do for all the elites. You need to co-opt those elites. In other words, you need to have carrots and sticks. Now, in order to co-opt, a ruler has many, many different instruments. Right? You give, concessions on land. You give subsidies to those elites, or you induct them in your cabinet, right? Or support their businesses. Authoritarian regimes use a whole array of economic privileges. They distribute economic privileges strategically to those sectors of society whose support is crucial, right? So, this country A, it has particular kind of group, ethnic group, or particular kind of business group that is important for the rule. You give the support, and that support is usually consistent with the potential of these elites to oppose you. And that's how an entire rentier structure survives, is by distributing those privileges. Now, there are a whole range of economic policies that you could use to buy off the support of these groups. And people have talked about the role of subsidies, people have talked about the role of credit policies, how do you give particular cheaper credit to certain business sectors, etc. And it happens in political, in sort of democratic regimes too, but we are really talking about the specificity of the authoritarian rule. One such instrument to co-opt elites is trade policy. And while there has been a lot of work on other types of policies, there's very little work on trade policy. A lot of political economy and trade policy really compares democracies and non-democracies. And it looks globally at the world and says, well, democracies tend to be better, more open, they're more globalized, they tend to have more open trade policies. Whereas autocracies are less open to trade. But there is a huge stream of variation within autocracies. Right? Autocracies of all different types. And so what type of instruments they use to co-opt different elite segments. Is trade policy really different in authoritarian regimes? Is a question that I largely go. Okay. So that's the larger project. And in this project, I started working by just looking at, firstly, Muslim societies, and especially non-oil Muslim societies. And I find that as the developing world faced growing pressure to liberalize trade in the late 1990s, many of them became members of the World Trade Organization, many of them signed programs with the World Bank or the IMF, and international development institutions pushed them to liberalize trade, to reduce their tariff barriers, to be open to more, greater capital account freedom, etc., etc. When that global push for liberalization was taking place, I find that Muslim societies, especially non-oil rich Muslim societies, relative to other similarly situated non-Muslim societies, were less open to trade. They were less globalized. The speed of globalization was slow. And I argue that this is not to do with Islam, it's more to do with the rentier political structures. That a lot of these societies are authoritarian. And of course, authoritarian rule requires you to be careful how you open up the economy. And when you're faced with a global pressure to open the economy, you would say, okay, I want to earn some brownie points and be seen as a reforming regime. I want to sign WTO, I want to engage with the European Union, the likes of Morocco, Egypt, other places. So we want to have that reformist credential, but how do we make sure that we liberalize trade in ways that does not upset the political equilibrium? Because if you reduce trade barriers, it can mean that a lot of the entrenched businesses who benefit from trade protection will have to now compete globally. So what a lot of these countries did was to liberalize, but liberalize in a selective and highly partial manner, which is to say, they said, okay, you are asking us to reduce tariffs, we'll reduce tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports, right? So you are importing, let's say these screens, and there's a particular import tariff on this. Then you will liberalize differentially. There are certain sectors where there's no problem, you let it liberalize. But there are certain other sectors which are maybe controlled by the military and its companies. You liberalize less. Or maybe there are sectors that are penetrated by politically connected firms, and so you liberalize much less. So overall in the economy, tariffs come down, but there's a differential reduction in tariff, depending on different sectors of the economy. There's another way that this trade liberalization could be partial, and that is to do with trade policy substitution, which is to say, one type of trade barrier is removed or it comes down, another type of trade barrier actually goes up. So in this case, tariff measures, tariff barriers came down, and then non-tariff measures, which I'll explain soon what these non-tariff measures are, they ended up increasing more, which means that on the face of it you've liberalized, but practically you have compensated for reduction of tariff barriers with an increase in non-tariff measures. So this partial liberalization, this hesitant, reluctant approach to globalization, to globalize, to open up their economies, is ultimately rooted in the underlying rentier political structure, which demands that you carefully open up the economy so that you benefit certain sectors. Sectors where politically connected firms are present will see less trade liberalization. So I'm going to present you 3 pieces of evidence to support this argument. The first, I'm going to present you evidence which is cross-country it is based on analysis of Muslim economies, Muslim societies, and non-Muslim societies. So I'm going to show you that when the global push for liberalization came in the late 1990s, most developing countries, one way or the other, liberalized, especially around the time of WTO establishment in 1995. Muslim societies were more hesitant in terms of their liberalization, and therefore, on established measures of globalization, liberalization, they fall behind many of the other developing societies, because we are not including in our analysis the likes of Europe or even Eastern Europe or other places, just developing countries, so that we compare likes with those. So that would be the sort of starting piece of evidence that I present. Then I'm going to present to you some evidence on trade policy substitution, and I'm going to present to you argument about how a number of Muslim societies, particularly in the Middle East, Morocco and Egypt, they signed the European Union trade agreements. And as a result of those trade agreements, tariffs fell in a massive way. But after the fall of tariffs, non-tariff measures, which are defined in a moment, which is an alternative form of trade barrier, actually went up. So counteracting any sort of impact of trade liberalization. But then I'm going to show you highly fine-grained data on politically connected firms. So which are the firms in Morocco that are connected to the kingdom? Which are the firms in Egypt that are connected with the Mubarak's regime and how sectors that are penetrated by these politically connected firms were the ones which had lower trade liberalization, which had higher levels of non-tariff measures. And then I'm going to conclude by presenting you some evidence from Pakistan, some of the work that I'm doing, where again I show how sectors where you have prominent business families, prominent politically connected firms are operating, that's where overall level of tariff protection is actually increased. So this is the broader remit, because this is a cluster of projects that are part of the talk, because SN and Lutfi currently asked me to give a big picture thing. I have 3 slide packs, and I'm not going to present all 3 slides, but I'm going to now just show you the relevant pieces of evidence from all of these projects, so that you get a full picture view of this. So let me begin by first presenting to you some of the work that I've done with my co-author, Professor Ahmed from Princeton University. And here we've really looked at 2 things. I mean, one is that if you look at globalization, there are different ways in which people measure a country's stance to globalization. Essentially, if I zoom this figure, you can see that there is a measure called the Kaufman QF Globalization Index, and this index basically measures not de facto globalization. So it doesn't look at how open countries are in terms of trade to GDP ratio. It looks at de jure globalization. And why de jure is important? Because de jure are regulations. And in my other work, the book on crony capitalism in the Middle East, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2019, we showed that post-liberalization, after liberalization, regulation and its enforcement became an important arena of privilege. That you have a raft of regulations, and after trade liberalization, a lot of countries actually increased it, but they imposed lots of new regulations, sometimes for good purposes. But when the enforcement of those regulations, when that issue comes into play, those are really enforced selectively. So this measure actually looks at what are different kinds of trade restrictions, what are the different kind of investment restrictions that countries impose. And so an example of it could be in Benelux, Tunisia. You're procuring certain things. There are particular kinds of regulations that are designed to benefit specific actors, right? Or in Morocco, if you are going to open up the telecom sector, the banking sector, a lot of the licenses are still in the hands of the government. And who gets these licenses is not very open or transparent. And you have to often partner with one of the regime insiders to get that. So a lot of these restrictions can also be quite innocuous, very innocent in a way. But actually when you implement them, when you enforce those restrictions, they could be selectively enforced. So this index basically provides us a summary measure of the globalization stance of a country. And the data goes from 1970 up to the present times. And we divide the global sample into similarly situated countries, countries that are dependent on external rent streams like aid and remittances, are not oil-rich, because oil-rich countries have very different dynamics in terms of their trade. So, and it basically splits the sample between Muslim societies and non-Muslim, and Muslim being majority Muslim, more than 70% of the population being Muslim. And you find that 1995, around this time, when the WTO was established, and many of them became members of WTO, but even countries that were not members of the WTO faced that pressure to liberalize, because each country at that time was facing pressure to liberalize their economy. And you find that Muslim societies, globalization, there's a clear globalization deficit relative to non-Muslim societies. So while non-Muslim societies liberalize their economies a lot more, many of the Muslim societies did not. And so this globalization deficit, this hesitant, reluctant approach to globalization is the key puzzle that we explore, and we look at the logic of authoritarian rule, because we argue that a lot of these Muslim societies are actually authoritarian. So if you, here is another plot which basically looks at the political deficit. So this is normalized polity score, which is a ranking of how good your political institutions are, whether you're open or not. And similar, you find that on average, Muslim societies are less, obviously less democratic. But since 1995, when again the world faced the pressure to liberalize polities as well, liberalize the political system, Muslim societies also lagged.
You refer to non-Muslim emerging countries.
Muslim majority countries. Yeah.
Non-Muslim emerging countries. I mean, those
Yeah.
are not in Europe, right?
That's right. That's right.
Otherwise, this is
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and so then we conduct, extensive analysis in terms of empirical work, and we run a difference in differences regression analysis, looking at how Muslim societies have fared relative to non-Muslim after the WTO establishment relative to before WTO establishment.
Methodology is very difficult. I mean, other things should be constant, but there are lots of different variables.
That's right. So we have to demonstrate that the only difference is this one, and we control for a whole range of characteristics. And here is the results. You could see that prior to the WTO establishment, there's no statistically significant difference because all of these are intervals, which include 0. But it's really after the WTO establishment that you see a globalization deficit emerging. So that's the larger sort of question that we explored, and here is a set of regression results which similarly show a negative coefficient, statistically significant. So it's showing how Muslim societies in general were non-resource rich Muslim societies relative to other non-resource developing societies faced a globalization deficit. So that's the first part, is the larger question. And then I really frame this as part of a number of country-specific works. So he's a colleague of mine, Ferdinand Ivo, with whom we looked at Egypt. So we looked at how Egypt partially liberalized only after 1995. And a lot of that partial liberalization, selective liberalization, is ultimately rooted in politics, because Mubarak's regime had connections with particular kinds of politically connected firms who were important, who were members of the National Democratic Party, whose support was crucial for the regime. And so when the push came to shove, and they had to liberalize, they liberalized in ways that these businesses are still doing. But in this case, before I get into Egypt, I'm going to talk a little bit about the larger authoritarian context as well. And here what's interesting is that you might recall that a lot of developing countries signed these preferential trading agreements. You know, literally every country in the world signed different types of preferential trading agreements. And in fact, the number of preferential trading agreements increased from 100 in the 1990s to 700. That's just a massive increase. And a lot of this trade agreement was with countries of the developed north, right? The US, EU, in Asia it's Japan, right? With many countries, poor countries in the south. And I'm going to get to this later in the Q&A session, but a key question is, authoritarian regimes actually sign up a lot of trade agreements, right? It's not that they do not sign, and here we show how the cumulative number of North-South FTAs increases in 2000, just before 2000, in democracies, but they also increase in autocracies, which is this dashed line. So in fact, there's not much difference, right? Both types of regimes are signing. So why would autocratic regimes agree to liberalize trade when it can actually hurt their economic interests, especially can cost them the support of politically influential constituencies? And this is a question I'm posing, but ultimately the answer to it lies in the same statement that I made before, which is that it's because they're able to partially liberalize. They don't fear joining WTO, they don't fear joining PTAs. And in fact, if you look at the EU southern countries' FTAs, there's a massive difference. In fact, more autocracies are likely to join these trade agreements with the EU. So they're not really worried about that. And so, why is it that autocratic regimes agree? Well, one reason is because many of these FPTAs, or preferential trading agreements, are what we call in trade policy terms shallow, which is to say they're just focusing on tariffs. They're not looking at an entire raft of economic policies that actually become part of the de jure globalization, investment restrictions, non-tariff measures, etc., etc. The other reason they are willing to sign this is because of what I mentioned before, the idea of trade policy substitution. One trade policy instrument being replaced with another. They know that if tariffs fall, we have other measures to compensate. And of course, a lot of these liberalization generates new rents as well. Liberalization generates new opportunities to earn money for the elites as well, especially when you liberalize sectors in a significant way. And in fact, if you look at autocracies, you can see that autocracies are more likely to join shallower agreements. So this is the depth of the trade agreement, right? And so the smaller the number, the shallower that trade agreement is, which means it only covers one or two dimensions, not very dimensions, maybe just focus on trade. And it's quite significant. But then you look at what actually happens when tariffs fall, non-tariff measures actually increase. And you know what these non-tariff measures are? These are basically when you have imports, there's a transparent way, which is a clear trade policy instrument, which is tariffs, which are import taxes. So 20% tax, 500% or 200%. Whereas the non-tariff measures are regulations, right? If you are importing a fridge and there is a big sign on it that it meets the environmental requirements and it has energy efficiency, etc. So these are labeling requirements. And so if the European Union gets olive oil, for example, from Morocco or from Turkey, they will say, okay, you need to have sanitary and phytosanitary conditions. Yeah, you have to meet those conditions, and then yes, your fruit could come into European markets. But that means that those restrictions, they're required to facilitate trade, but they require enforcement in the sense that somebody at customs authorities has to see if they are consistent, if there's a labeling requirement being met. These are often called pre-shipment inspections. And on the face of it, many of these non-tariff measures are straightforward measures that are not there to restrict trade, but in many developing countries they could be enforced in a highly selective way. If I'm a big guy connected with the authoritarian ruler, or my business has political voice, it's very easy to get those things crossed through custom authorities compared to someone who's unconnected. So although it's different from tariff measures, actually non-tariff barriers can become as costly, if not more, as cumbersome, if not more, than tariff measures. Right? So in these plots I'm showing that actually, if you look at the percentage of coverage of non-tariff measure, NTM imports, so percentage of imports covered by non-tariff measures, 5 years after joining the FTA versus 10 years after the FTA. And so we find that globally, this is a global sample, 5 years after the FTA, non-tariff import coverage increases. 10 years after, it increases by about 45%. This is also percentage change when NTMs applied, so some NTMs that are applied. Either way, 5 or 10 years after a country signs a free trade agreement, the non-tariff measures increase. And what we find is that actually they increase more in autocracies than in democracies. So in fact, in autocracies, they actually fall. But really the NTM, this additional trade barrier, becomes more important in autocracies 5 years and 10 years after. So in other words, post-PTAs, post-free trade agreements, there's been a greater evidence of trade policy substitution. Tariffs being replaced by non-tariff measures. Now, why is that the case? Why is it that autocracies find more of this trade policy substitution? Much of my subsequent work and evidence will show you that autocracies are quite fine with this increase in non-tariff measures because they effectively are able to use this additional trade instrument as a way to compensate politically connected firms. Okay? And so, if you look at, this is all literature I've already talked about. All I'm going to do now is to really give you a sense of the selective liberalization episode in Egypt. So in Egypt, you had, these tariffs are coming down, right? And then you have non-tariff measures actually increasing about the same time. And this is the time, 2004, when Egypt signs a trade agreement with Europe. And the thrust of that trade agreement was on tariffs. And so tariffs fell as a result of signing a trade treaty with Europe. And the year after, all the sectors witnessed an increase in non-tariff measures. But of course, politically connected sectors had higher level of tariff production, non-tariff production. So, how do I find politically connected actors? Firstly, how do I find what are these NTMs? And so, the World Trade Organization, UN, UNCTAD, the World Bank have actually coded a very detailed database on non-tariff measures, where they have created measures of which product, there are like 6,000 products that are traded globally, right, in the manufacturing space. Which product has which NTM applied and when was it applied? And so you have these different types, A, B, C, D, E, right? So the technical measures are sanitary, phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, pre-shipment inspections, etc. And when you talk about non-tariff measures, they are the most important trade barrier today, right, with China and the US trade policy coming into friction. Tariffs are becoming more important, just in that case. but globally, NTMs now contribute more than 70% of global trade production, more than 70% of the global trade production. And in majority of countries today, NTMs are twice as restrictive to trade than tariffs, right? So it's really important to understand what these non-tariff measures are and why they might be applied differentially in autocratic regimes. So what we do is we basically look at a major tariff shock in the wake of an EU trade agreement. So let me first explain how we collect data on politically connected firms. So there's a big established literature in economics that looks at politically connected firms. And the literature looks at whether the firm has a shareholder or a board member who is connected with the ruler or the ruling party or has been a cabinet minister, etc. So you identify for each country that. So I did that for Egypt, and there's a lot of information. You know, if you're in Turkey, for example, you would know who are the big business guys, who are the big business families, and that's it. In every democratic country, that's the case, but particularly in authoritarian regimes, it's very clear. You might have heard of the name of Ahmed Az in Egypt around the time of the revolution. He was a big steel magnate, right? And so in each sector, you know, this guy really controls the market. And so there's press reports, there is academic literature, expert interviews, and we used a book by Stephen Broll in Germany, who categorized all the big business families who became allies of Mubarak's National Democratic Party. And so we systematically looked at those individuals. And then we went to the Orbis database, which provides shareholder information about firms. And we systematically matched how many of these individuals are shareholders of these big companies, and then looked at what products those companies are producing and which four-digit sector they operate. So this was the whole process, and it's a very laborious process because you are looking at different data sets, you're compiling, and it's quite fine-grained work. In other words, it's looking at 119 four-digit sectors. So the idea would be that for each sector, I would know whether that sector has NTM or not, non-tariff measure, and whether that sector is penetrated by politically connected actor or not. All right, so here are some families. So you're looking at Abul Anan family, former MP, chairman of housing committee. A lot of these MPs are members of these committees in the parliament, and they're members of those committees that shape the larger incentive environment in that sector. So if you are, if you have big stake in housing, if you are a member of housing committee, you are going to make sure that the housing policy really functions in ways that doesn't upset your interest. There are some others who are associates, like members of the Egyptian American Business Council, etc. So there's an interesting external dimension to it, because in both Egypt and Morocco, a lot of the big businesses were part of these business associations that were also linked with Europe and the US. And I'll actually end the presentation on that larger point. I hope I remember that. All right, so this is the sort of data. And then what is the basic result? Here are these different types of sectors. We're looking at food products, tobacco, textiles, wearing apparel, right? So all that. And proportion of the subsectors that have crony presence. And we find that in this era of liberalization, 1995 onwards, you see a growing penetration of crony actors. So about every sector, literally every sector is 1.4 cronies per sector. Right? And we are going to look at how much the sector is penetrated by cronies, so more like an intensity of treatment. Here is the setup. So 1995, Egypt signs the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership Agreement. Then they sign, and it comes into force in the Egypt-EU trade agreement. In 2005, that agreement comes into force, and you might recall the figure where in 2005 the non-tariff measures are increasing in a big way. So in our analysis in differences sector, we look at, we treat all those sectors that were penetrated by politically connected firms. By 1996-98, we treat them as cronies. Of course, cronies are continuing to enter after this time period as well, but we are excluding them for the moment. And then we look at what happens to the share of non-tariff protection after 2005. And we find that, and this trade agreement, by the way, was part of a larger sort of effort to liberalize trade. And I'll again talk about the geopolitics of it towards the end of this. It was a universal shock. You could see tariffs are coming down, especially they come down after, after 2004, when they signed the trade agreement. And immediately afterwards, you find non-tariff measures, the share of non-tariff measures going up considerably. And so this is the big pattern that I want to show. The next thing I want to show is that this trade policy substitution, which is falling tariff barriers and rising non-tariff measures, actually applies more to politically connected firms. So if you look at this result, this is the basic result. So if you look at the sort of density of NTMs, the crony sectors which are highlighted in bold color, you could see this shock hit all the firms, whether you were connected or unconnected. You saw an increase in non-tariff measures, but this increase was higher in politically connected sectors compared to unconnected sectors. And this effect is quite significant after this time period. There are a lot of these other things that we did, but shortage of time, I'm going to really wind up and show you similar evidence from Morocco and also from Pakistan. So I did similar work on Morocco, and again we find very similar pattern, that there is a one minute, let me show you the format, very similar format. Yeah, so very similar format. Morocco signed the European Partnership Agreement. Overall tariff barriers come down. The partnership agreement comes into force in 2000. And while average tariffs fall, just like Egypt, you find the non-tariff measures actually increase, right? And so, again, there are these different politically connected sectors. The red color, the non-tariff measures increase far more compared to unconnected sectors. So you could see globalization is pushing these countries, especially trade agreements with Europe, are geared towards reducing tariffs, and as a result of tariff liberalization, what these regimes are doing is basically they're replacing them with other types of measures, trade policy measures, which are benefiting politically connected firms more than others. I guess I'm short of time, so maybe I can just, do I have 5 minutes?
Yes, yes.
Huh? Okay, so firstly, to give you a sense of why this matters, what are these non-tariff measures? So if you look at these non-tariff measures, there are different types of measures. So these are contingent measures, distribution, export related. These are PCM, I'm forgetting what it's called, but it's a pre-shipment inspection. But most of these are technical barriers to trade, like sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, technical barriers to trade. And these are significant because they require the intervention from a bureaucrat. There's a bureaucratic oversight that is needed. In fact, if you look at if you look at particular kind of this is. I need to show you something else. Just 1 minute. Okay, maybe these are old slide packs, but basically what I wanted to show you is that these non-tariff measures, yes, this is the one. If you look at just the distribution of technical barriers to trade, the database is so fine, it tells you what particular type of measure. And you could see how B84, inspection requirement, right? B859, traceability requirement. B89, conformity assessment. These are all requirements that require bureaucratic oversight. And so even if the EU says, here is this little regulatory barriers you need to have, you need to make sure that it meets certain requirements, it can actually have the unintended effect or the entirely opposite effect, because it means that it requires enforcement, and that enforcement would require bureaucratic oversight. Now, in terms of rents, you could find that actually this, economists work with what we call ad valorem equivalence. If you were to give a value to these non-tariff measures, how much a non-tariff measure would be in terms of a tariff, its tariff equivalent, so that we give it percentage, you could see over time ad valorem equivalent of NTMs increased by 100%, but they increased by 300% for sectors in which politically connected actors. And there was also higher standard deviation, which we said there's more variability. What does this mean? It means that a lot of these sectors, cable sector, where Al-Suwaidi family was active, not only did the introduction of non-tariff measures compensate these sectors, that they lost tariff and they get a compensation, but they actually got additional protection at the end of, by the end of 1997. So in other words, they were able to get more protection than before, even if they had liberalized trade. And so this is an important aspect. And why is it an important aspect? Because, there's a great quote here by my friend Abdullah Dardari, who was a former Minister of Finance in Syria. And he said way back in the time, that, WTOs, the time of the WTO, now rent seeking will finish, because, the WTO will set the rules, and all these cronies have been feeding on government projects, but now they have to compete. Now, he was clearly wrong, because cronies are very powerful. They know how to play around the system and change their modus operandi. And in fact, there's a great paper by Luigi Zingales in Political Theory of the Firm, prepared in Journal of Economic Perspectives, in which he argued that as the size and complexity of regulation increases, it makes it much easier for vested interests to tilt the playing field. And this is exactly what partial liberalization did. It basically tilted the scales. So, two final points I'll make, and then maybe I can then close. One is some recent work that I've been doing exactly on trade policy protection in Pakistan, and I look at how trade policy over time has evolved since the era of liberalization, and how do different special interest groups, politically connected firms, shape overall trade protection. So again, you find, like other developing societies, tariff liberalization is falling quite a bit, but NTMs post-2010 are increasing massively. And again, you look at, let me give you some broad numbers here. So if you're looking at the share of non-tariff protection, they are increasing in sectors that are organized, and those that are powerful families. You could see the differences, a much higher number, significantly higher protection of non-tariff measures in organized sectors, which are these sectors with big business lobbies, and similarly with more powerful families. The intensity of NTM protection is a huge, statistically significant difference in these. And then maybe let me take you to the final part, which is this. In Pakistan we have something called the regulatory barriers. There are other types of regulatory duties. So not only tariffs came down, but the effect of falling tariff barriers, rather than just the NTMs, there were also regulatory duties that were slapped over time. And these regulatory duties came into effect in 2008, and then in the Musharraf period, and they remained higher. These regulatory duties were higher in politically organized sectors. But after the arrival of Nawaz Sharif's government in 2013, they increased significantly. And then this difference between connected and unconnected sectors actually is maintained in subsequent periods, including in Imran Khan's government, because a lot of these business families are powerful, they remain in all the political parties. Doesn't matter who's in power, they will continue to be influential. So the end result of all of this is the following. The end result is really summed up in this plot. Like, this is the overall tariff protection. This includes tariff measures, non-tariff measures, regulatory duties, and you could see since the eve of liberalization, overall tariff protection has fallen. But actually, post-2005, you could see that this protection is higher in sectors whose support is crucial for the survival of the regime. And you could see that these connected sectors, these blue sectors, have significantly higher level of trade protection. So what's the story then? The big story really is about the politics of partial liberalization. The idea that Muslim society, many of the Muslim societies, when they faced the pressure to liberalize their economy, they did it in a highly selective and hesitant fashion, reluctantly engaged with liberalization. And this reluctance, this partial liberalization is ultimately explained by a political logic, which is that they need to liberalize selectively in ways that does not hurt the interests of those groups of society, those elite members of those business classes whose support is crucial for the survival of the regime. And there you see a clear sense. So are Muslim societies really exceptional? No, they aren't. It's more about the authoritarian political structures, the rentier political economy, and that logic of rentierism and political economy of authoritarianism is relevant to most societies. Now, I promised that I'll end the talk by talking about this entire emphasis on geopolitics. There are two things that are quite important here. One is that a lot of international literature had argued WTO, international trading rules, they're nice, North-South trade agreements are good. Why? Because there's a great book by Leonardo Vicini, he's a famous political scientist who's done some excellent work in this area, but he argues that, well, like us, he says, trade cooperation is intertwined with domestic politics, but they say, well, it's nice to have these trade agreements because if you're a ruler, you face pressure for domestic protectionist lobbies, and international trade agreements can tie the hands of the ruler and make him implement reforms that they otherwise would not. So it's a sort of positive story, and there's certainly a lot of logic to that. But a lot of this international literature on political economy of international trade agreements has cast a rather favorable light on the role of international trade agreements, ignoring some of these dynamics that we've explained, right? So they are really asking about, how economic reform is supported by international institutions. What we are saying effectively is that, yes, that might be so, but there is a very important international dimension, which is to do with how these authoritarian regimes game the system in order to first look very reformist, because they are now signing WTO, they're liberalizing trade, they will get good stories in Washington Post, FT, and the like. But in effect, what they're doing is they're really protecting, continuing to afford similar kind of protection to predict that practice. So I'm just going to quickly show you a shot. There's an interesting report in Carnegie Endowment by Al-Khoury. Talks about how a lot of the international emphasis on trade liberalization really came after 9/11 in Muslim societies. So he talks about how after 9/11 the connection between trade policy initiatives and security was strengthened. In fact, there was a Council for Foreign Relations report that argued that Muslim countries face the threat of extremism. How do you fight that? Support the private sector, liberalize trade, it will create job opportunities, address grievances, right? And so it was also part of that process that Barcelona Agreement, the EU's Barcelona Agreement came into place. But in effect, what was happening was that a lot of these countries were signing trade agreements with Europe and the US. But many of the cronies who benefited from this process were the ones who were at the same time directors or managers of EU-Egypt Trade Association or America-Egypt Trade Association, right? So they were very influential at that level, and they also had political offices. But ultimately also the EU's emphasis more on shallower trade agreements, especially on these liberalization through tariffs alone, and a lot of emphasis on non-tariff measures actually backfired. Because in a way, a lot of those hopes that were raised about trade liberalization proved to be untrue. So that's the overall, I mean, I've tried to squeeze 4 presentations into the one presentation, but they're all part of a coherent story. And of course, when you do papers, you have to be quite methodical and rigorous in each one of them. But the larger argument is really about political economy of trade policy in authoritarian regimes. Right? So how authoritarian regimes use trade policy in ways that helps them survive, helps autocrats survive power. And the story I've presented is interesting because there's an important element of dynamics that, it's not that autocratic regimes do not sign trade agreements. It's not that they don't enter into WTO. Many of them do enter into WTO. Many of them, like Algeria, resist, but many of them do. Many of them want to be seen as reformers, right, and playing by the rules of the international system. But both the international system and their domestic political economy allow them to work this whole system in their advantage and helps them to survive in the face of these challenges. So
Thank you. Now it's time for
questions or even clarifications, because some people may not know what kind of data, what kind of methods.
Should I need your points? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think
Just a question. Your story, I mean, I find your story is very similar, but the model that you use, if it is the idea in all your papers, is a question. For example, it says, I mean, the FTA leads to more NTMs in politically connected sectors. That's the basic causal mechanism, right? So you have a trade group, you have the trade group, which is the FTA, and the control group is the other sectors which are not politically connected.
Yeah.
And the FTA should get total exogenous in order to have justified the model. But in your speech, you said there's a kind of explicit, I mean, those politically connected sectors or businessmen would like to benefit from the FTA because there's an opportunity there, the rent, whatever they are. So the first, there is exogenous issue.
Yeah.
The second one is maybe the selection bias might be a problem. Yeah, I mean, and plus, you mentioned that the Yuga and the capital. So maybe, I mean, what's on paper there will be different what's on practice. Maybe there will be more those in practice because, I mean, whatever they've written is on the paper, there must be. So maybe this is another that I noticed. So basically, the ideal model will not be very good at to justify your story.
Yeah, so I think my defense for that would be that, as I mentioned here, that a lot of these trade agreements, particularly in Egypt and Morocco, were determined by outside considerations. As the slide says, this primarily determined by external strategic imperatives. And those who study business-state relationship in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, they know that, and Tunisia may be a slight exception, but at least Morocco and Egypt, you have trade associations, but they're very much centrally supervised. They don't have huge power to articulate their preferences. The idea that they could have driven this trade agreement. They could have driven a lot of the contextual evidence, a lot of the global evidence of how they faced the pressure of 9, and then EU Barcelona process itself was a very top-down process. And also the political economy business trade relationship in these places such that rarely do they have the power to really drive international trade agreements. For many other countries it could be relevant, but certainly for these two countries. So that was our first premise. The second is that of course it's a universal shop that applies to all sectors. And selection issues could be important. So for example, it is possible that cronies enter into sectors where they anticipate that there's going to be tariff reduction.
By selection, I mean you already select a group, which is a politically connected businessman, and that's based bias in the ID itself.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of DID literature that also, political connection, whether you are politically connected or not, could be determined by other factors that might also shape trade protection. That's true. So in that case, you have to control for those factors. So that's what we did. We controlled for a whole range of factors that might predispose. So starting with fixed effects, right? So food sector, auto sector, there are many, many sectors.
Is it easy to find a sector in which the politically connected businessmen are not present?
Yes, there are. There are sectors. So for example, if you look at, so I'll just show you this one. So there's a proportion of sectors that are controlled by, so office, accounting, computing machinery, we couldn't find. These are proportion of subsectors with sort of 59%, very high in food sector, but they're still, sort of 41%.
It should be a competitive sector.
Less than 50, there's just a few.
Yeah, so there is variation, and what we are seeing also is extent of crony penetration. But also when you're looking at tariffs, if you also did a test here, I can show you. I mean, the other thing about all of this is parallel trends assumption. So that is, we try and do all those tests that are standard, but there is another one, which placebo tests, all those. We did DID with IV, so in this IV what we did is we said, okay, sectors in Egypt may be selection-wise, but if we instrument the Egyptian crony variable with Tunisia, because Tunisia, sectors will, those cronies will not enter into those sectors which might be driven, but they could. And then similarly, we did, I don't know whether it's here or not, but we actually looked at the extent to which penetration of prior trade protection is not predictive of crony entry. So if you're looking at previous crony entries, and that might drive. So there are all these sort of standard tests we do, and the weight of evidence suggests that actually, despite accounting for all of these different, but one of the papers actually come out in the European Journal of Political Economy, and that the one in Morocco, and there we've already addressed even more of those concerns. So, in general, fairly robust characteristic, but yes, if when you apply DID to this context, you have to show extra evidence to suggest that it's not just. We also included sector into time trends, where you look at some sectors over time might witness greater liberalization or greater regulatory harmonization, and therefore greater end-to-end protection. But even if you include sector into time trends, the effects can surprise. So it's fairly robust.
My name is Abdul Karim, but we mostly focus on some reasons or issues. I just want to ask some solutions. For example, as you give an example, from Morocco, for example, I watched a documentary about the king of Morocco. He mostly the one who controlled, maybe you can say, the most lucrative businesses in the country.
That's right.
And in many countries, you can see that the most successful business people are always controlled by the government. For these kind of countries, what can an ordinary trader, what can they do in order to challenge these kind of systems? Because these kind of things, in order to maybe change something, you need to have some power with you. What can like an ordinary trader do in order to challenge this kind of systems?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, in a way, when you talk about cronyism in simple terms, it can be misleading that, you know, there are these sectors that are politically connected and others that are not, and you're giving the impression that your political connections are bad. But actually there is a lot more complicated than that. In every polity, in every economy, when you grow up to a particular stage, you become connected because you're powerful, right? It happens in democracies, it happens in autocracies, etc. But in certain cases, political connections are more harmful when they unlevel the playing field. Right? And so yes, you might be a sector where there's a firm that is politically connected, but that crony is facing a lot of competition from other cronies. Or maybe that firm is operating in a sector that faces international competition. The ultimate point is that if you are politically connected, if with that political connection you close off market competition, then it's a really unfair advantage, right? Whereas there are states, you know, other cases where the sector where you operate matters. In our crony capitalism volume, there's a great paper by Isaac Atias, talks about Turkey, talks about the Anatolian tigers, and again, here you see, you know, there were the firms in Istanbul and Ankara and Izmir, these are the big guys, right? Old protectionist lobbies. And then they were counteracted over time by the new Anatolian tigers. These were small and medium enterprises that were younger firms, that grew more, and they were more export oriented. So they were not closing off the local economy as such, right? They had to compete. They were getting benefits. The ARC party has clearly benefits this particular segment of the market space, and that's a global phenomenon. But they have to compete, at least when it comes to the export sector. Same goes for Korea's Shables, right? They were also politically connected, but they had to compete in the global market too. So just saying that you have politically connected firms is not enough. You need to know the context. Right? What is the context, which sectors they are operating, how do they use political connections to undermine other sectors, right? There's a great quote in Douglas North's book, Institution Change and Economic Performance, where he says, all organizations, in early stages of development, all economic organizations are also political organizations. And that's true, you know, because at that level of development, the moment you become successful, right, you come in the limelight, right, or the ruler needs your support. So I think when you say what we need to do is really a difficult question, but the question that one needs to ask is how it distorts the competitive space. In many of these countries that I discussed, including Pakistan, you have these politically connected firms who are typically operating in non-export sectors, who are typically working in non-tradable sectors, and they are also distorting trade policy in ways that can affect the long-term productive frontier of the economy. Right? And they're mostly non-export oriented sectors. So which sector does it operate in? What can the small and medium enterprises do? Well, you need that kind of competition between the big guys and the small guys. One way is collective organization. In Turkey, for example, over time you've seen how Musiat has grown in significance. You know, there was a time when it was all about Musiat, right? Now they have difficulty finding who's going to represent them, who's going to be the head of the business association. So it's ultimately about competition. There's always going to be some people who are bigger than others, some people who are more connected than others. But how do you distort the level playing field, or how much is that level playing field distorted? But there's the need for more research. There's the need for more cross-comparative cases, you know, from Africa, from Latin America, across sectors. Yeah.
You can, for example, justify your story with a case where there is a change in the rule and
change in the
rule,
yes,
and a new political elite or authority which comes up with the support from those who would like to have more open trade, more competition, for example, like the case you mentioned.
right.
Yeah. But that might be also
Yes.
justified.
At least there is a formal democracy in Turkey. I think it supports that.
Yeah, but you know, this is also justified.
Yeah.
Your story.
Yes, absolutely. So political connection is everywhere. You know, some level of political connection is there, especially because when you become rich or an influential firm, you are in the spotlight and you know, you'll be called upon to do things. But in a lot of these countries, there are restrictions that really benefit those tiny set of factors, like the small, concentrated elite, which can be problematic for the entire sector. It remains suppressed because the rules of the game are being set to favor those few. So this is one reason why, when pushed to liberalize, many developing Muslim societies liberalized finance more than trade. You know, why? Because it's easy. You know, if I finance, if I open up the telecommunication sector, well, if I'm the king, you have to partner with French Telecom, you partner with me. Fine. You know, there was a very interesting thing in WikiLeaks for Morocco, how real estate decisions, it mentioned how the real estate decisions were made by literally 3 people, the king and 2 other people. Right? And so, trade liberalization is more problematic for them because that means their rents could be competed. I'm going to show you something.
It's also related with the relationship between global or international capitalist groups with the local groups. They use the local groups while they're entering into the countries.
Yes.
For that reason, the liberalization of finance is necessary for such a relationship.
Possible. I think there is literature around that subject. Yes, yes, it's possible. We need to study that. Here is this plot for you. I mean, if you look at, this is Morocco, entry of crony firms, right? So how many crony firms entered? So you see mid-1995, a lot more firms, crony, politically connected firms, set up their operations in non-tradable sectors. And so when you're talking about non-tradable sectors, these are basically real estate, finance, banking, you know, service-oriented sectors, right? Because their restrictions could be higher, right? And in fact, what this plot is telling you is that actually the king and his royal holdings, and they don't make any sort of bones about it. I mean, it's all the king's holdings. Even on Wikipedia page, you can see the royal holdings for the king, which have a lot of holding companies. They're mostly in non-tradable sectors because these are what we call rent-thick sectors. It's easier to because you need license if you're going to open a housing society, or you're going to open a bank, or you're going to have a telecom operation. You need a license from the government, and so these regimes are more comfortable liberalizing those sectors because they know that ultimate lever of control remains in their hand. Right? Compared to trade, where you know you have to compete, the whole range of factors that might influence. Yes, you might get some preferential credit from the state, maybe you get some preferential other thing, a policy, but you have to ultimately compete.
It also shows that there is no competition as well. I mean, tradable sectors are always almost same.
Oh, what? Sorry?
Almost same. I mean, if you look at the trend.
Yes. Yeah, there is an increase.
Yeah, I mean, it will be in the case. I mean, where you have the, I mean, because it's not a very open economy.
Yeah.
In any case, the number of firms operating in the non-tradable goods will increase.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, in tradable goods, there is global industrial standards.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But even if you were to scale it by a country of all firms, even then the department would. But yes, I mean, obviously that is.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Malik.
Any other question?
I don't see no other.